The Soviet T-34 tank, on the backbone of the Red Army, stood as a powerful symbol of Soviet resilience and victory. But when the war ended, the mighty machines faced an uncertain fate. Abandoned in fields, left to rust in the aftermath of destruction, the T-34's journey transformed from a weapon of war to a relic of history. What happened to the thousands of T-34 tanks after the battle? How did they survive decades of change and shifting power? The story of the T-34 after World War II is one of quiet adaptation and enduring legacy, a reminder of the forces that shaped the world, bottom end of the battlefield. The Soviet T-34 tank is one of the most iconic machines of World War II, a symbol of Soviet resilience and the backbone of their armored forces. It is remembered for its devastating impact on the battlefield, a tank that could overpower German armor with its raw power, mobility, and innovative design. But what happened to these formidable machines once the guns fell silent and the war ended? The answer is neither quick nor simple. As World War II drew to a close, the Soviet Union found itself facing a new and far more complex set of challenges. The war had drained its resources. Its economy was in shambles, its infrastructure shattered, and its industry, once focused on wartime production, now needed to pivot to rebuilding the nation. But amidst this, there was another pressing question: what to do with the thousands of T-34s that had once dominated the battlefield? At the end of the war, the Soviet Union had somewhere around 60,000 T-34 tanks in its possession, scattered across Europe and within its own borders. Of these, a staggering 35,000 were left in Eastern Europe after the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the immediate aftermath, many were left abandoned in the ruins of war-torn cities or hastily dumped in the outskirts of battlefields. The scale of the surplus was overwhelming. Entire fields were filled with rows of idle T-34s, their gun barrels pointing aimlessly at the sky, a haunting reminder of the conflict that had consumed them. The logistical nightmare of dealing with these vehicles was immense. The Soviet Union had no desire to continue maintaining such a massive fleet of tanks, but they couldn't simply abandon them. First, there was the issue of the resources tied up in each tank. The production of a single T-34 had cost the Soviet economy valuable steel, fuel, and manpower. The immense quantities of tanks on hand now represented an unthinkable cost if left to rust away. Additionally, many of the T-34s were still fully operational, though now outclassed by newer designs and less useful in the context of post-war military needs. Initially, there were efforts to simply dismantle and scrap the surplus. Tanks were stripped of their parts, some of which were recycled into new machinery. The Soviets, already experiencing a severe shortage of raw materials, found this to be an efficient way to salvage what they could. Yet, as the years passed, it became clear that the process was far from enough. The sheer volume of tanks on hand made it impossible to dismantle them all in a timely manner. Beyond the logistical strain, there was a broader question facing the Soviet leadership: what to do with a military force that had already served its purpose and, in some ways, had become a symbol of a past war, an emblem of the brutality and sacrifices that defined the Soviet experience in World War II. The T-34 had proven effective in combat, but in peacetime, it had become a weight, an asset too costly to maintain and too outdated for modern warfare. Faced with these questions, the Soviets began to make a more drastic decision: the tanks would be put to a new use. Some of them were sent to the Far East, where the Soviet Union had an ongoing interest in expanding its influence. These tanks would not be deployed in traditional combat, but rather as a symbol of Soviet strength in territories far removed from the battlefields of Europe. Other tanks were handed off to the satellite states of Eastern Europe, where they would form the backbone of the post-war communist military apparatus. In these countries, the T-34 would become part of the larger propaganda machine, a tool to solidify Soviet influence in the region. Still, not all of the tanks could be repurposed. Many ended up being sold or given away as military aid to nations in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The T-34 found its way into the hands of governments in need of affordable military vehicles, often those who had recently gained independence or were engaged in regional conflicts. For these nations, the T-34 offered an opportunity to quickly arm their forces, but at a heavy cost. The logistics of maintaining such outdated tanks were difficult, and over time, many of these tanks simply fell into disrepair. Parts were difficult to come by, and the costs of maintenance outweighed the benefits of using the T-34 in combat. For some, the tank became little more than a rusting monument to a bygone era. In the Soviet Union itself, the decision to abandon the T-34 as a frontline tank was a hard one, but inevitable. The war had left the country with an abundance of outdated military equipment, and the T-34, despite its legacy, simply didn't fit into the future vision of Soviet warfare. The new era of jet-powered aircraft and guided missiles required a different type of military force. Tanks, while still necessary, would need to be faster, more heavily armored, and equipped with more advanced weaponry. The T-34, though still effective in some contexts, was seen as a relic of a past war. In the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union made the decision to retire the T-34 from active service. By then, the tank had already seen significant use in conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, but it was now clear that it no longer had a place on the modern battlefield. Large quantities of T-34s were removed from Soviet military inventories and placed into storage. However, even in these conditions, the tanks were not forgotten. They were maintained in reserve, ready for possible use should the need arise. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the T-34 continued to serve in various capacities. Some were given to newly formed socialist nations as a symbol of the Soviet Union's support, while others were retained for domestic use in civil defense and military parades. In some instances, the tanks were even placed on display in public parks or used as static monuments to Soviet military might. Over time, however, the T-34 began to disappear from active military service. Many were quietly scrapped, their once immense numbers dwindling to just a few hundred across the Soviet Union and its allies. By the time the Cold War ended, the T-34 had become a historical artifact, a relic of a bygone era. Yet, in the former Soviet republics and across the world, the T-34 remains a symbol of the strength and resilience of the Soviet Union during World War II. Many of the surviving T-34s are now displayed in museums, monuments, and memorials, where they stand as a testament to the immense scale of the conflict and the sacrifices made by millions of soldiers. For some, these tanks represent victory. For others, they are a reminder of the devastation wrought by war. The fate of the T-34 after World War II is not one of dramatic battles or heroic rescues, but of quiet, inevitable change. As the Soviet Union turned its focus to rebuilding and modernizing its military, the once feared T-34 faded into the background, its legacy reduced to the pages of history books. The tanks that had once stood as symbols of Soviet might were now left to the passage of time, their purpose fulfilled, their future uncertain. Yet, even as they were dismantled, repurposed, or abandoned, the T-34's impact on the world could not be erased. The T-34, for all its glory, was destined to fade away, becoming yet another forgotten piece of history in a world that constantly moved forward. In the years following the T-34's retirement from active Soviet service, its legacy continued to echo through the remnants of Cold War geopolitics. While the Soviet Union had officially moved on to newer models like the T-55 and T-62, the T-34 still loomed large in the collective memory. By the 1960s, many of these tanks were no longer seen as tools of war but as historic relics, indicative of a past struggle that, despite its outcomes, had shaped the global order. Yet, what remained of the T-34s, scattered across a planet divided by political lines, would continue to live on in ways no one could predict. In Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, the T-34 was more than just a tank. It had become an enduring symbol of the Soviets' victory over Nazi Germany. It stood in military parades, memorializing the sacrifice and power of the Red Army. But while it was honored in public ceremonies, its role in combat had long since ended. These tanks were often placed in strategic locations to symbolize the Soviet Union's military prowess, either in cities, military bases, or at the borders of the satellite states. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, these tanks, along with others, were left to sit quietly in the backdrop of everyday life. By the 1970s, however, the Soviet Union's post-war relationship with its satellites began to shift. The tanks were no longer serving as tools for an impending invasion, they had become trophies of a bygone war. For the Soviet Union, maintaining such obsolete equipment in Eastern Europe was expensive and inefficient. As part of a larger reorganization of military assets across the Warsaw Pact, some of these T-34s were returned to the Soviet Union for scrapping or storage, while others were left behind in the hands of new socialist governments as a form of residual influence. But even within the Soviet Union, the end of the T-34's frontline service marked the beginning of its new role as a tool of propaganda and civil defense. Soviet authorities had no intention of letting these tanks fade into obscurity. In an era where symbolism was integral to statecraft, the T-34 found itself on display in towns and cities across the Soviet heartland. Some were even repurposed as training vehicles for future generations of Soviet soldiers, not in active combat, but in learning how to repair and maintain military equipment. In these new contexts, the tanks became a type of historical education tool, teaching soldiers of the Cold War era about the might of their forebears. However, as the 1980s approached, the remaining T-34s in active military use became even rarer. The tanks were increasingly replaced by more modern models like the T-72, which reflected the Soviet Union's growing military sophistication. By the time the Gorbachev era came to power, military resources were more carefully allocated to newer, more strategic platforms. The old T-34s were now seen as expensive to maintain, inefficient in modern warfare, and increasingly symbolic rather than practical. Many of the surviving tanks were quietly stored in depots, gathering dust and waiting for their eventual fate. Yet, in an unexpected twist of historical irony, the T-34 found new life in conflict zones far from the Cold War battlefields. During the 1970s and 1980s, tanks once used by the Soviet Union were sent as military aid to countries embroiled in conflict. T-34s were sold to nations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, including countries like Angola, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. There, these tanks would take on new roles, often as the last line of defense for insurgent movements or anti-colonial forces. In Angola, the T-34 was used by both sides of the Civil War, and in Afghanistan, it was pressed into service by the Soviet-backed government fighting against the Mujahideen. In these conflicts, the T-34 proved both a blessing and a curse. While still possessing formidable firepower, its age and technical limitations became apparent when compared to more modern tanks in service. Maintaining the T-34 in these distant lands was a logistical nightmare. Parts were hard to come by, and crews trained on newer equipment struggled to keep the tanks in operation. Yet, in many instances, the T-34 was all that was available, making it a workhorse in countries where resources were stretched thin. The T-34, once a symbol of Soviet military might, now stood as a testament to the enduring nature of wartime machinery, adapting in unexpected ways to new conflicts. While the T-34 had been discarded by the Soviet Union as an active combat asset, it was by no means forgotten. In the post-Soviet era, the surviving tanks, particularly those in Eastern Europe, underwent a transformation. With the collapse of the USSR in 1991, many former Soviet states now faced the reality of dealing with outdated military hardware that was no longer needed for defense or prestige. But instead of scrapping them all, the T-34 found itself preserved, often by private collectors, military enthusiasts, and museums across the newly independent countries of the former Soviet sphere. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the T-34 has been preserved as a symbol of national pride. Though many have been left to rust away in forgotten fields, others have been painstakingly restored, their gun barrels polished, and their tracks rebuilt. Museums dedicated to World War II in Moscow, Kyiv, and Warsaw proudly display these tanks as part of the story of the Soviet Union's struggle against fascism. The T-34, once the weapon of war, had now been transformed into a piece of living history, viewed with a sense of nostalgia and respect by the generations who had never known its firepower on the battlefield. The transition from a battlefield machine to a symbol of history is perhaps the most fitting end for the T-34. Though its technical limitations had rendered it obsolete long before the fall of the Soviet Union, its role as a tangible reminder of the price paid during World War II ensured that it would never truly disappear. The T-34 continues to stand as a monument to the vast scale of the war and the sacrifices made by millions. In many ways, the T-34 has become an artifact of memory, preserved for posterity, with its physical form forever tied to the collective consciousness of the war it helped win. For all its history, the T-34 in its many forms, scrapped, restored, abandoned, or preserved, remains a relic not only of the Soviet Union's wartime triumph but of an era in which war machines held the power to reshape the world. Its journey from battlefield to museum is as much about the shifting tides of history as it is about the perseverance of a vehicle that helped define a war and an era. In the end, the Soviet T-34 tank, once feared and revered, faded from active service. But through its long afterlife, it continues to remind us of the indelible mark war leaves on machinery, nations, and memories alike.